Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. So today is Trinity Sunday, and we're going to discuss one of the characteristics of God is omnipresence. What does omnipresence mean? Being everywhere. All right, who wants to start reading? We're on number 240, right here on your printout.
Okay. When we were debating whether God truly is in each and every minute creature, in the grass, in a tree, etc., he, Martin Luther, responded, "It is so, for God is excluded from no place and is confined to none. He is everywhere and he is nowhere." The question was asked whether God is only potentially everywhere or is actually everywhere. He replied, "God is in every creature in both ways, because although a creature acts for its properties, God acts not through his properties, but through his being." Thereupon somebody said, "I do not understand that." He, Luther, countered, "Do you believe that Christ on the cross was God?" "Yes." "Do you believe that God was in the womb of the Virgin?" "Yes." The principle here is the same, for it is equally possible to man's reason in both cases as impossible that God can be enclosed in the womb of a virgin, as it is that he can be enclosed in every creature.
Thereupon the other person said, "If he is, then the devil too. Yes, and essentially, he is in hell too, as it is written in 2 Thessalonians, chapter 1, verse 9. It shall suffer the punishment of eternal destruction and exclusion from the presence of the Lord."
For you ladies who weren't here when I introduced this, I said this is going to be one of the more difficult things we've ever looked at in my 2 years here. There's a lot to unpack in here. So, any questions? If you have no questions about this, you are far more qualified than I to read this, to lead this class.
I don't know how to ask a question.
I think it's interesting, if I heard it correctly, that God is in hell.
Yeah, we're gonna be talking about
Yeah,
that when we get to the end of this reading, don't worry.
Okay.
Like I said, there is a lot to unpack here. So what does it mean that God is everywhere and nowhere? When Dean was out here cutting the grass the other day, was God in the grass?
That's neat, he's gonna cut it.
But he created the grass.
He created the grass, certainly. Was he in it?
Well, his presence fills everything, so
Mhm.
yes, yeah.
Absolutely. So was Dean cutting God in half?
No.
Impossible.
The reason I asked the question, and as silly as it sounds, is there is a branch of Christianity, a branch of religious thought called pantheism. God is everywhere, therefore everywhere is God. God is everywhere, we wouldn't argue with the word of that. Therefore, everywhere is God is objectively wrong. Because if that was the case, we all ought to starve to death. Because God is just as much just as much cow as he is apple.
Did that happen at a study? One of my friends killed the bug and the other friend about cried. He said that was God or something.
Yeah,
He was a Buddhist.
yes. And then we got into an argument over whether Buddhist miracles are real, and I offended her deeply. Because at a certain point, I don't let idolatry stand. And I told her, yeah, the devil's powerful too. So, if God is in everything, but God isn't everything, what does it mean that God works through not through his properties, but through his being?
Spirit, I mean, the spirit is, you don't understand, but it's everywhere.
I understand what you're saying, but I think maybe defining the two terms, properties and being, is worth, it would make it clearer what we're talking about. What are my properties? You're a little heavy. Not by much, but a little. You're not gonna offend me. What are my properties?
Tall,
Fairly tall, yes.
strong,
Fairly strong, yes.
chubby and cute.
Half of that's accurate.
Religious,
Mhm.
enjoys food. We're getting quite new then.
That's fine. You see, it's easier to describe me than it would be for you to describe yourself, because we border on bragging. Which,
I'm all saying you.
I have been tempted to give you one of these.
Oh, there's a lot more to talk about.
Anyway. But did anything Nancy just said about me describe precisely who I am? No. She said things about me, but she didn't describe me. She described my properties, not my being. But I am human, and not God. Sorry if that disillusions any of you. But I function through my properties. What I do is based on things about me that If I suddenly lost my strength, would I stop being me? If I suddenly shrunk 2 feet, would I stop being me? Those are properties, not being, right? God, we describe him by his properties, his omnipresence, his omniscience, his almightiness, things like that. Because we cannot comprehend his being. But through his being, through who he is, he functions. We, on the other hand, along with every other created being in the world, functions through our properties. It is a function of grass to grow. It is a function of roads to hold up until they start to break. It is a function of buildings to stand until gravity acts on them enough to cause them to fall, right? Those are their properties, but not their being. God acts through his being. Who God is and what God does are indistinguishable for us because we can fundamentally not understand who God is in the first place. So we can only describe him through what he does. Do you always understand what God does? Because you don't understand who he is. And you can't. Is what I'm saying making any sense at all? We work through properties. I am much taller than Caitlin, so I can get things off the top shelf. These are just facts. If my legs got cut off, I wouldn't cease to be. It's just that I'd have to rely on her to get things off the top shelf. So what principle does Luther equate God's omnipresence to? After that, a little further into the reading.
Being born of the Virgin Mary.
Yes.
Being born of the Virgin Mary. And
Also
being on the cross when he's died.
God was enclosed in a woman's womb. God suffered and died on the cross. Do you believe that? Do you understand it?
No.
It is not for you to understand, it is simply for you to believe. If you can believe that, you can believe God's omnipresence. So is God in the devil then? If God is everywhere, he would logically then be in the devil. Which leads to a problem, doesn't it? If God's in the devil, why is the devil the devil? He does a lot of evil, but if God's in him, how can he do evil? Well, let me ask you this. Yes, you, on fewer read-throughs than I had to give this thing, have found the distinction. Is God in you? You ever done anything wrong? You made it to church this morning without having done anything wrong? Exactly. If God's in you, that doesn't necessarily mean he controls your actions, right? You are not robots. no created being outside of angels are able to do things perfectly at all times. Okay. Angela, well,
Should we waiting for us outside? We haven't done.
you might have to go. You know where you're going, right?
By the museum?
I have excused my wife from the recital as she is picking up someone who wishes to come to church. And do you have a problem with that, Mildred?
The last one had a problem with it.
Yeah. You see, I pick on her with things that are the opposite of her properties. I'm not too worried about it. I've seen her with the lawn. She might farm that work out to her daughter, though. So if God is everywhere, including in the devil, one more point about that I neglected to make. I got a little distracted. If God were not in the devil, it would be far more difficult for God to prevent the devil from doing the things that God prevents him from doing, wouldn't it? Because God knows his thoughts, knows his actions, knows what's coming, and knows how to stop it. So how does the verse from 2 Thessalonians that Luther quotes strengthen his argument? Because on first blush, at least to me, it seems to completely abrogate his argument.
They won't see the goodness of God, but they don't know the presence, if that makes sense. They don't know God, but they don't see his goodness.
Many of you are parents. Some of you aren't, but I think you can understand this, because you've had parents. Oftentimes, parents are a loving presence in your life, right? Sometimes they're not. Sometimes their presence is terrifying, right? And if things are working the way they ought to be working, their presence is terrifying because of something you've done wrong, right? That's what hell is. Sinners in the hands of an angry and vengeful God. You may have heard of a sermon preached hundreds of years ago by that name. That sermon's garbage, because that sermon tries to apply that to us. That does not apply to us, not right now. It applies only to the people in hell. God's anger, God's vengeance is wrought on those who have denied him and denied his grace. God's love and his mercy is shown to those who believe in him. And hell is simply a place where people who have denied God's mercy, denied God's grace, go to receive their vengeance and punishment. God is there, and the absence of his love and grace is what creates that punishment. Just like Now, never for me, because as stated earlier, I was a perfect angel the entire time I was growing up. But for other children, the presence of parents can be a terrifying experience because they've done something wrong. Does it make the parents wrong, bad, or evil? It makes what the children have done and the punishment they're experiencing unpleasant, because these normally loving presences in their lives are now terrifying. God is normally a loving presence in our life, but if we reject him, his presence would, by its nature, be terrible. Correct? I know this is, I wasn't kidding when I said this is probably the most difficult thing we've covered so far. Would you agree with that assessment? Any questions on what we've talked about? I picked this one, and then the thought occurred to me we might have a visitor. And so I knew that if that was going to be the case, I'd have to start scrambling, and you'd get a Bible class I wrote 20 minutes before Bible class. But with this group, I felt confident that I could at least cover these things in a way that wouldn't be too disconcerting. Is my assessment correct?
At one time, after the flood and then on into Babel, people believed all in the same true God. And then all the heathen stuff started. But it seems to me that a lot of the false religions like Hinduism and Buddhism all kind of seem to try to follow the concept of omnipresence in a way that they're looking at it humanistically. We went to a Buddhist temple, and the temple is constructed to look like a dragon, and the dragon's tail is throughout everything in the temple. I mean, it starts and it just goes to an end point around beams and everything else. So somehow these people, even though they're believing in the false gods, still believe in an omnipresence. So they know there's a God around. They just rejected a lot of truth, probably all the truth.
An outside analysis of world religions, Christianity included, would conclude that 90 to 95% of every teaching is roughly the same. These analyses have been done. In fact, there's a famous story about one such conference of leaders from all the world's religions meeting in London at one point in time. And they got together to discuss, well, what makes each religion distinct from each other? And they were talking and finding so many more points of commonality than they found of difference, and they were getting confused and frankly irked by this. The author C.S. Lewis walked into the conference a little late, and as a Christian, they looked at him and said, well, what makes Christianity distinct from any of these other religions? He looked at them and said, that's easy. Grace. The concept of grace is foreign to every other religion. Every other religion is based on what you do to get right with God. Christianity, at least when done properly, is based on what God has done to make you right with Him. That is the fundamental difference between our religion and every other religion in the world. And the fact that this is the only religion with that difference argues strongly, even in the face of doubt, that this is the true religion and everything else is man-made. Because, well, it's the only one that doesn't make perfect sense. Think about it. Christianity doesn't make perfect sense. Every other religion does. And the fact that you and I can understand every other religion argues that they are false, because God should be smarter than we are. I'm seeing a lot of blank expressions. Did I just state that so
No, I'm-
brilliant?
Just
I'm
thinking
thinking, we have,
furiously. It's absorbing.
we had a friend that, said, well, we're talking religion, usually it's that simple, you know, what you just said. And we went to Catholic, which I use that teaching in with what you do.
Yeah.
And it's just too simple for us.
Okay, anything further on any of this?
It's like,
Then I'll press stop.